Graphing inequalities. Inequalities, like equations, are statements with expressions on both sides. Inequalities have the greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, and less than or equal to symbols instead of the equal symbol from an equation. Another difference between inequalities and equations is the type of solutions that you get. In both, the variable is isolated, but in inequalities, you get an infinite number of solutions. Equations give us answers like x equals 5, while inequalities give us answers like x is greater than 5. Since the inequality gives us an infinite number of solutions, we often graph the solution set. Let's look at this example. We're going to graph x is less than -2. The first thing you're going to do is find your endpoint. This -2 is going to be your endpoint, so we'll make a mark there. That's our endpoint. Now we're going to shade half of the number line. You're going to shade the part for x, so the part that would make it true. This says x is less than -2. So numbers that are less than -2 are going to be to the left. So we'll shade this half. And then we have to decide about the endpoint, the -2 itself. It depends on our notation whether we want to include it or not. If we have greater than or less than without an equals underneath, we will use a parentheses. We do not want to include it. If we have an equals underneath, we will include it, and we will denote that with a bracket opening in the direction of the shading. So notice on your inequality symbol there is no equals underneath, so we want to use parentheses, and we will open in the direction of the shading, so it needs to go to the left. Let's look at this example. We want to graph x is greater than -2. So we'll find our endpoint, which is -2. Then we're going to shade the half that makes it true. This time it says x is greater. So it's going to be bigger than -2. It will be to the right of -2. So we'll shade that side. And then we decide about the endpoint, the -2 itself. There is no equals underneath, so we do not want to include the -2 in the solution set. That's denoted by a parentheses. It will open in the direction of the shading, so this time it will need to go to the right. This time let's graph x is greater than or equal to 3. So first thing is we need to find the endpoint, which is the 3. We want x to be greater than or equal to the 3. So greater than 3 would be to the right of 3. That's bigger. And then you have to decide for the 3 itself. This time there is an equals underneath. It is greater than or equal to. The equals will cause us to choose a bracket so that we include the endpoint. Now let's graph x is less than or equal to 3. So the first job is still to find the endpoint, which is going to be the 3. And then we want to shade the half that makes it true. So x is less than the 3 or smaller, so we're going to shade to the left. That would be smaller than the 3. Then we have to decide about the 3 itself. This time we have less than or equal to. The equal to underneath is what causes you to choose a bracket instead of a parentheses. It will open in the direction of your shading. The next one we're going to graph does not have the x on the left. It's a little more awkward to graph because we have to read it from left to right. It says graph 1 is less than or equal to x. So we're still going to first mark the endpoint, which will be 1. And then we're going to shade the half that makes it true. We're going to shade for the x. This says 1 is less than the x. So if 1 is smaller than the x, then the x has to be bigger than 1. We're shading for the x. So we're going to shade to the right. If you have a choice anytime when you're solving, keep the x on the left so the graph will be easy. But if you have to graph one of these, you can. Just be careful, and sometimes you have to re-say it to yourself. So we found the 1, and it says 1 is less than the x, so x had to be bigger than 1. So we shade for the x to the right. Then we'll deal with the equals sign underneath. So it has the equals underneath. That means choose a bracket instead of a parentheses. You're going to include that 1. It needs to open in the direction of your shading. Next, we'll graph for one that has a fraction. We're just going to have to guess at the location of the fraction. So x is less than or equal to 1/2. So 1/2, it's positive, so it's between 0 and 1. So I'm just going to go about halfway, and we'll say that's about a half. And we want to shade for x. X is smaller than the half, so it's going to be to the left. And then we do have the equals underneath. So that will be a bracket. It will open in the direction of the shading. And we might mark our fraction on here. We'll say this is a half. If your number line is not already written out for you, all you have to really show is your endpoint. You don't have to show the other numbers. In our last example, we're going to graph what's known as a double inequality. Notice it has two inequality symbols in it. So it's actually going to have 3 sections in the graph. Your endpoints are the -1 and the 3. So we're going to find those. So our -1 and our 3. And this says x is between those. So we're going to shade in the middle part. The -1 is less than the x, and the x is less than 3. But an easier way is just to say x is between -1 and 3. So it's going to be this middle section. And then you have to choose for your endpoints. For the -1, we do have the equals underneath. So that will be a bracket opening in the direction of your shading. And then for the 3, there is no equals underneath. So that will be a parentheses opening in the direction of your shading.